They told him not to speak. And for 50 years, he didn't. At 89 years old, Charles Duke, one of only 12 humans to ever walk on the moon, finally broke that silence. But ask yourself this. Why would a man trusted with one of humanity's greatest achievements stay quiet for half a century? And more importantly, what could possibly be worth hiding for that long? Before we go further, you need to understand who Duke really is. This isn't a fringe voice or a conspiracy theorist. This is a man forged in discipline and precision. A graduate of the United States Naval Academy. A test pilot with thousands of flight hours. A scientist trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And one of NASA's most trusted astronauts. In fact, on July 20, 1969, during the historic Apollo 11 moon landing, Duke was the voice in mission control, the only voice Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were allowed to hear. When alarms blared inside the lunar module, when computers faltered, when seconds of fuel remained, it was Duke who made the call to continue. And because of that decision, humanity landed on the moon. So here's a question for you. Do men like that imagine things? Or do they report exactly what they see? 3 years later, Duke got his own mission, Apollo 16 mission. He and Commander John Young spent nearly 3 days exploring the lunar surface. By all official accounts, the mission was a complete success. But if you look closely at the footage, something feels off. There are moments where Duke suddenly pauses, stares into the distance, as if something has caught his attention. The camera never follows his gaze. Nothing is explained. And for decades, he said nothing. Until now. When Duke finally began to speak, he didn't start with anything dramatic. He started with something simple. Something subtle. Something deeply unsettling. The light was wrong. Think about that. On the moon, sunlight should be pure white. There's no atmosphere, nothing to scatter or distort it. No blue sky. No haze. No diffusion. Just raw, unfiltered light from the sun. But Duke described something impossible. Colors, appearing where they shouldn't exist. Blues drifting across gray dust. Purples shimmering at the edge of vision. Patterns that seemed to move, not with the terrain, but across it. Not reflections. Not shadows. Not equipment glitches. The light itself seemed alive. Now ask yourself, how does light behave in a place where nothing exists to alter it? At first, Duke assumed it was fatigue. After all, space travel pushes the human mind to its limits. Isolation. Pressure. The overwhelming awareness of being somewhere no human was meant to be. But then it happened again. And again. Always just at the edge of perception. Always just long enough to notice, but never long enough to confirm. And that's when doubt begins to creep in. Not the kind of doubt that questions what you see, but the kind that questions yourself. Then came something even harder to explain. Sound. Let's be absolutely clear. There is no sound on the moon. No air. No atmosphere. No medium for vibrations to travel. And yet, Duke heard something. At first, it was faint. A low hum. Almost below the threshold of hearing. But it grew. Not louder, but clearer. Structured. Rhythmic. Almost intentional. He later struggled to describe it. It wasn't music. It wasn't noise. It was somewhere in between. Something organized, but not human. And then came the moment that changed everything. He turned to John Young. He didn't want to ask, because asking would make it real. But he did. Do you hear that? There was a pause. A long one. The kind of silence that says more than words ever could. And then Young responded. Yeah, I hear it too. Now stop for a second. 2 astronauts. 2 highly trained, mentally stable individuals. Both hearing something that cannot physically exist. So what do? Do you report it? Do you write it in the mission log? Or do you bury it? Because even saying it out loud sounds impossible. They chose silence. And they kept working. But the anomalies didn't stop. In fact, they intensified. Duke later described something even stranger. Time itself. Not the measurement of time, Those instruments worked perfectly. But the experience of time. It began subtly. A task that should take 10 minutes felt like 2. A short walk across the surface felt stretched, elongated, almost dreamlike. Moments blurred. Sequences felt out of order. At one point, Duke recalled completing an entire checklist, only to realize the clock showed almost no time had passed. Now ask yourself this. If your perception of time no longer matches reality, what can you trust? Your instruments or your mind? And what happens when those two begin to conflict? Then came the part Duke struggled the most to explain. Not something he saw. Not something he heard. Something he felt. At first, it was just a sensation. A subtle awareness. The kind you feel when someone is standing behind you, even if you can't see them. He tried to ignore it. Focused on the mission. On the procedures. On the data. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger. More defined. More focused. He described it years later in a single sentence. You feel observed. Let that sink in. Observed. Not alone. Not isolated. Watched. Now ask yourself, if nothing is supposed to be there, then who or what was watching? And then, they found it. It wasn't part of the mission plan. It wasn't marked on any map. It wasn't something anyone had prepared them for. During a routine traverse several kilometers from their landing site, Duke noticed something on the horizon. At first, it looked like a trick of light. A distortion. A mirage. But the moon doesn't have an atmosphere. There are no mirages. So what was it? He adjusted his position. Looked again. And this time, it didn't disappear. It became clearer. Defined. Structured. Straight lines. Sharp angles. Geometry where there should only be randomness. He called it out to Young. At first, Young dismissed it. Optical illusion. Shadow interplay. But as they moved closer, he saw it too. And everything changed. The structure, if that's what it was, stretched across the surface, partially buried beneath layers of fine lunar dust. It wasn't towering. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was subtle. Almost as if it had been there for a very long time. Long enough for the moon itself to begin reclaiming it. But not long enough to erase it completely. Duke later described it as unmistakable. Deliberate. Engineered. Ancient. And here's where things become even more unsettling. There were no signs of impact. No crater. No debris field. Nothing to suggest it had arrived there by force. It was simply there, as if it had always been there. Waiting. Now let me ask you something. If you were standing on another world, and you discovered something that shouldn't exist, what would you do? Would you approach it? Or would you turn back? Duke and Young did what they were trained to do. They investigated. Carefully. Methodically. Step by step. Every movement calculated. Every observation internalized. But something felt wrong. Not dangerous, exactly. But significant. Important. As if they had crossed an invisible line. The closer they got, the stranger it became. The surface around the structure felt different underfoot. More compact. Less like loose dust. More like something had disturbed it. Or shaped it. Duke later recalled an overwhelming sense of hesitation. Not fear. Not panic. Something deeper. Instinct. The kind that tells you, you're not supposed to be here. And yet, they kept moving. Because that is what explorers do, isn't it? They walk toward the unknown even when every instinct inside them is screaming to turn back. They do not stop when the terrain becomes strange. They do not retreat when the silence grows too heavy. They keep going, step by careful step, because curiosity is often stronger than fear. And that is exactly how Charles Duke and John Young found themselves staring at something that should not have been there. The moon had already stripped away every illusion of comfort. There was no wind, no sound, no soft horizon like the one Earth offered. Only an endless gray emptiness, jagged rocks, powdery dust, and a sky so black it looked carved instead of painted. Their footprints marked the surface behind them like a temporary trail left in a place that would never forgive them for being there. Every movement was deliberate. Every breath inside the suit felt loud. Every second carried weight. Then they reached it. At first it was just a shape at the edge of their attention, a disruption in the natural order of the landscape. But as they drew closer, the thing became harder to explain away. It was not a simple outcrop of stone. It had edges, structure, alignment. The surface seemed to catch the light differently than the surrounding terrain, as though it had been shaped by something other than time, impact, and chance. Up close, it was even more perplexing. The lines were not perfectly straight, but they were not natural either. Angles intersected in ways that did not match the usual fracture patterns of lunar rock. Some surfaces appeared smooth, almost polished, as if worn by repeated contact or intentional finishing. Other sections were rough and pitted, eroded by ages of micrometeorites and exposure. Yet the overall formation remained intact, stable, and strangely deliberate. Intentional. That was the word that lingered in the mind, even if no one dared say it aloud. Duke wanted to document it. He wanted to photograph it from every angle, record measurements, compare notes, preserve evidence before the moment disappeared into memory like so many other impossible things. But something stopped him. Not a force. Not a physical barrier. A feeling. That same feeling again. The unsettling awareness that he was not alone, even here, even in the dead emptiness of the moon. It was as though the silence had depth, as though the void itself were listening. And the more he stared at the structure, the more the sensation sharpened into something almost unbearable. Watching. That was the only word that fit. He glanced at Young. And for a brief moment, their eyes met through the visors, separated by glass, pressure, oxygen, and the impossible reality of what they were seeing. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Human beings do not always need language to understand fear. They do not need conversation to recognize the instant when reality has slipped slightly off its foundation. This shouldn't be here. That thought passed between them like electricity. So here is the question that has followed this story for years. Why wasn't it reported? Why wasn't it studied? Why wasn't it shown to the world the moment they returned? The official records of Apollo 16 make no mention of any strange structure. No anomaly. No unexplained artifact. No object that should have launched 1,000 scientific debates. On paper, the mission was clean, precise, and successful. A triumph of engineering and courage. A textbook chapter in human achievement. But life is rarely as neat as the official record suggests. Because now, decades later, Charles Duke's silence has begun to crack. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in a single confession that solves everything. The cracks began small, subtle, almost invisible. A remark here. A pause there. A memory that seemed to surface unexpectedly after years of being buried. And with every statement he shared, the outline of something larger began to appear. Not a complete picture. Not yet. But enough to raise a deeper question. If something was truly there, hidden in plain sight, on the surface of the moon, then what else have we missed? Or perhaps the more unsettling question is this: what have we chosen not to see? Now pause for a second and consider it. What are the odds that nature creates perfect right angles on the moon? What are the odds that rock and dust, without design, arrange themselves into forms that look engineered? What are the odds that two trained astronauts, moving carefully across the most alien terrain humans had ever visited, would both feel the same unease at the same moment? Could it all be coincidence? Could it be that the mind, under pressure and isolation, begins to interpret patterns where none exist? Or could it be that some things are so unusual they naturally trigger the instinct to deny them? According to Duke, they reported what they saw to mission control. And the response? Delayed. Cold. Controlled. Continue with your planned tasks. No questions. No investigation. No urgency. Just a calm instruction to move on, as though what they had seen did not matter. As though the strange formation had not just interrupted one of the most important exploratory missions in human history. So they did something quietly. They took photographs. Dozens of them. Careful, measured, intentional photographs. The kind of evidence an astronaut would take if he knew he might need to defend his memory later. The kind of photographs that say, "This happened." The kind that are supposed to outlast doubt. And yet those images were never released. Not to the public. Not to the historians. Not to the generations who would one day ask what the astronauts really saw. Over the years, Duke asked about them. He asked where the photographs went. He asked why some records seemed incomplete. He asked why answers changed depending on who was speaking and how much pressure they were under. Classified. Lost. Unusable. Different explanations. Same result. Nothing. And Duke's response never changed. "I know what I photographed." That sentence is simple, but it carries the weight of someone who has spent decades trying to make peace with an impossible memory. And then comes the part that unsettled him most. The age. There were microscopic impact marks on the surface of those structures, tiny scars left by endless exposure to the lunar environment. Those marks suggested an age far beyond anything human. Not decades. Not centuries. Not even a civilization's recorded history. Millions of years. Possibly more. Which leads to a chilling realization. If something built those structures, it existed long before us. Before cities. Before language as we know it. Before written history. Maybe even before complex life on Earth had fully taken shape. So let me ask you directly. If something was building on the moon millions of years ago, what does that say about our place in the universe? Are we newcomers? Are we late arrivals to a cosmic landscape already occupied by something older, smarter, or simply better hidden? But Duke was not alone in voicing unusual thoughts. Other Apollo astronauts, in later years, began to speak in ways that made people listen more carefully. Not with dramatic headlines. Not with sensational declarations. But with the kind of quiet certainty that tends to linger long after the interview ends. Buzz Aldrin spoke about unusual structures near Mars. Edgar Mitchell suggested that non-human intelligence may have interacted with humanity. Others hinted, carefully and sometimes reluctantly, that the official story was incomplete. These were not fringe outsiders. These were men trusted with the most dangerous and expensive missions humanity had ever attempted. Men who had been trained to observe, to report, to stay calm under pressure, to distinguish between imagination and evidence. Why would they all arrive at similar conclusions? Why would so many experienced observers, separated by years and circumstance, keep circling the same shadows? Coincidence? Or something deeper? When Duke was asked in later years whether he believed there had been a cover-up, his answer was measured. He did not speak like a man eager to invent a mystery. He spoke like someone choosing his words with the caution of a person who understands the consequences of certainty. Not a conspiracy, he said. Something else. Institutional hesitation. And that phrase may be more frightening than any grand theory. Because it suggests that the data exists, the evidence exists, the knowledge exists, but it remains locked away not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. Too disruptive. Too destabilizing. Too likely to force questions no one is prepared to answer. Questions about who we are. Questions about where we came from. Questions about whether we have ever truly been alone. So instead of answering them, they were avoided. And avoidance has a cost. According to Duke, after Apollo 17, humanity simply stopped going back. Officially, the reason was budget, risk, political priorities, changing national focus, practical limitations. All reasonable explanations, at least on the surface. But what if that was only part of the truth? What if the moon was not abandoned because the mission lost value, but because it revealed something that could not be easily explained? What if our silence was not caused by boredom or economics, but by fear? What if the moon was never just a lifeless rock? What if it was a place that challenged everything we believed about the universe and about ourselves? Think about how human history has always worked. We discover, we question, we build a theory, and then we rewrite the theory when reality refuses to fit the old one. We once believed Earth was the center of everything. Then we learned otherwise. We once believed the ocean was the edge of the known world. Then we crossed it. So what happens if the next great correction is not about Earth at all, but about the moon? What happens if the sky itself has been hiding a chapter of history we were never supposed to read? Now, at 89 years old, Charles Duke has little left to protect. No career that needs defending. No promotion to lose. No mission to complete. Only one thing remains. The truth, as he experienced it. And in his own words, he has made something very clear. He walked on the moon, he saw things that were not in the official report, and the public deserves to know. That is not the language of entertainment. That is the language of memory. Of warning. Of a man who has carried a strange burden for too long and can no longer pretend it never existed. So now the question shifts to you. Not just what was found on the moon. Not just why it was hidden. But this, how much of our reality is still out of sight simply because it is too difficult to accept? How many truths remain buried because they would force us to rethink everything we have been taught? How often do we mistake silence for emptiness when it may actually be concealment? And one final question to leave you with. If the truth challenges everything we believe, would you want to know it? Or are some mysteries meant to remain unanswered? Because once a question like this is asked, it does not disappear. It follows you. It lingers at the edge of thought. It returns when you look up at the moon on a clear night and wonder what has really been waiting there all along. If this made you think, then maybe the story has done its job. But maybe the real story has only just begun.